and accountability in their state governments. This is the first time collectively as a group we have put together a study that shows some of these green mandates, renewable mandates coming out ahead now for the actual costs that these laws that are getting passed in the ISO grid are going to cost us as ratepayers and taxpayers. So everyone's going to have an opportunity to speak from the different states, and then we're going to open up to questions. I will say we do have one of the authors of the study, Mitch Rawlings, and he's going to be available for questions at the end. We will be done at 11 o'clock, and this interview will also be posted online. Everyone from the media that joined, you should have a copy of the actual study along with our press release, and that is embargoed until after this press conference. So I will just go ahead and get started, and then I will kind of go through the rotation of who will speak. And at the end, if you have any questions, media, please just unmute yourself, share with us your name, the org you're from, and direct your question to the appropriate person. So again, my name is Paul Craney. I'm the spokesperson for the Fiscal Alliance Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit group based in Massachusetts. We promote individual liberty, greater fiscal responsibility, and transparency in government for a better New England through education and legal assistance. So our study fits right into there because it's very educational. It puts together actual numbers. It's warning the public for what these laws have been passing, what that's going to impact them and their pocketbook and wallet. But I took some parts from the study that I just wanted to share with the group. If these decarbonization plans are realized, this is right from the study, New England will go from generating about 6% of its electricity from renewable energy, which is solar, wind, and batteries, in 2023 to generate about 71% by 2050. And you can look on graphs on page 17 and 18 that shows where we are now, basically last year, and where we're going if these policies continue to be in place. Our analysis anticipates that New England demand for electricity is expected to increase by 106% by 2050. And this is driven by home heating and transportation sectors. If you look on page 24, you'll see a graph, and this will be the cost for the ratepayers. The most economically efficient mix of renewable build-out would require over 6,600 offshore wind turbines, over 5,600 onshore wind turbines, and over 129 million solar panels. The solar panels alone will cover about 200 square miles. So think about all the belly aching going on with what we're doing off of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, with about 15 or so being built right now. And we're talking about 6,600 off of our shores and 5,600 onshore. Compliance with the New England Decarbonization Plan would cost about $815 billion through 2050. That's what the report concludes. New England families would see their electricity bills increase on an average of $99 per year. Commercial businesses would see their costs increase $489 per year. Industrial, which is manufacturing, customers would see their electric bills increase by an average of almost $5,280 per year. The report shows that on per capita basis, the total cost for each person in New England would be an additional $2,061 by 2030, $15,552 by 2040, and a staggering additional $51,914 by the year 2050. That's per capita in New England. All these increases will make New England obviously very unaffordable. And there's graphs on this on page 28 and 29. You cannot miss it. So for us at Massachusetts, and others will speak about this, we're hoping that these policies that have been being put in place in the ISO grid will come to a halt. And that simply means it's a win for the ratepayers. So other people are going to talk about costs, potential blackouts, how this impacts our states. But this is the first time we've had a study collectively with all the New England states for the ISO grid, putting actual numbers to these policies that have been being pushed throughout these states the last decade or so. As we hit these deadlines, things are starting to take place, and we're starting to see that happen now. And our study is warning the public for what's to come. So with that, we're going to go to Ross in New Hampshire, then David in Vermont, Paris from Maine, Andy in Connecticut, Giovanni in New Hampshire, and then Drew from New Hampshire. Drew from New Hampshire will close it off. So Ross, if you would share with the group what you want to talk about today.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and good morning, everyone. My name's Ross Connolly. I'm the Northeast Regional Director for Americans for Prosperity Foundation. We were proud to partner with the 6 New England think tanks to get this study completed and get a real picture of what these mandates and top-down policies are going to result in for the average New England citizen. We at AFP Foundation are the nation's largest research, education, and community engagement group. This is sort of the thing that we like to do across the country is really provide the information to constituents of what potential policy outcomes the impact it may have on their lives. As Paul mentioned, some of the numbers, currently 6% generation for green energy. The mandates have that at increasing to 71%. Energy, if it's reliable, affordable, and sustainable in the way that people are receiving the power, that is the lifeblood of the American economy. And when we start to chip away at that with these one-size-fits-all mandates that the New England states have put forward, it chops, basically the well-being of the average citizen. The increased costs to achieve this, as Paul mentioned, will be over $800 billion. That will be on the ratepayers of New England. So the doubling the cost of the impact of costs on ratepayers. Just imagine the impact that will have on the struggling, most vulnerable people among us in all of our states. And that's what we at AFP Foundation are concerned about, is these policies that will harm the very people that they say they're intended to help, the people that are trying to make their way up the economic ladder. As we just saw in recent election results, Americans very clearly said that they are tired of governments coming to them and asking for more and more and more. These policies will not result in making life more affordable, or more importantly, more prosperous for the people of New England. Basically, we are asking through these mandates across New England, basically every single state, we are saying that the pathway, the vision for New England to 2050 is one of economic contraction and one of despair. Especially, as I said, for the most vulnerable. Instead, we should be focused on opportunity and expanding the American dream and expanding economic opportunity for every single resident of New England. And that's why we agree with the policy solutions in this study, and encourage policymakers to do their research, look into our study, and hopefully adopt these changes so that every single person in New England has the opportunity to succeed. With that, I'll turn it over to our National Regional Director, Greg Moore, if he has any thoughts.
Thanks, Ross, and thanks, Paul, and thanks to all the folks who are involved with putting together this study. It's an important study because, in reality, life is about trade-offs. We have to make trade-offs in our daily lives every day. Fundamentally, the trade-offs a lot of people are making, particularly among the low and fixed income, is, can I afford my groceries? Can I afford my utility bills? Ultimately, the voters sent a very clear message 2 weeks ago that they wanted economic pragmatism over ideology, and they spoke pretty vocally to that nature. And at the end of the day, we need our strong policy solutions that are going to help solve these issues. I live in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a state that's going in a very different direction than the rest of New England, and that's a direction of focusing on abundance and economic opportunity. We're seeing the results of it. We're the one state that is in New England that's really seeing wage growth that's faster than inflation since the pandemic. And there's a message to be sent. New Hampshire is doing things the right way. And instead of focusing on a lot of top-down solutions, we're focusing on coming up with answers. And New Hampshire is a net electricity exporter. And that's largely because we've made a commitment to focus on finding the best ways to find affordable energy. And this study does a great job of laying out policy solutions that will help get us there. So with that, I'll wrap it up and pass it back to Paul.
Thank you. David Fleming from Vermont.
I'm David Fleming, representing Ethan Allen Institute in Vermont. Our mission is to influence public policy in Vermont by helping its people to better understand and put into practice the fundamentals of a free society: individual liberty, private property, competitive free enterprise, limited and frugal government, strong local communities, and personal responsibility. For the past decade, Vermont has passed successively more stringent laws and regulations regarding how electricity can be generated. 10 years ago, the legislature shut down the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant, which has been responsible for generating 3/4 of Vermont's in-state generated electricity, all with zero carbon emissions. Vermont now generates less than half of the electricity that it did a decade ago. Since then, despite millions in wind and solar subsidies to favored companies, Vermont produced only 15% more wind and solar powered in-state generated electricity in 2024 than in 2014. At this rate, it would take 140 years for Vermont to build enough in-state wind and solar generated electricity to replace the nuclear generated electricity lost. Wind and solar are simply not affordable and reliable options. With over 170,000 households relying on electricity to power their furnaces during the winter months, Vermont can ill afford to double down on a failing electricity generation strategy that places thousands at risk of losing electricity during the cold winter months. Access to affordable electricity was a top-of-mind issue in this month's election. Vermonters elected candidates who prioritized lowering Vermont's rising energy costs. Recommendation number 2 for our state for lifting state nuclear moratoriums would at least send a strong long-term message that Vermont's legislature is interested in considering all options for meeting our demand for electricity.
Thank you, David. Harris Van Pate from Maine Policy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Harris Van Pate I'm a Maine Policy Analyst at the Maine Policy Institute, specializing in legal and public policy. Maine Policy Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to expand individual liberty and economic freedom in Maine. Maine Policy is the strongest voice in Augusta for taxpayers and believes in open, transparent, and accountable state government. The analysis our coalition has released makes it clear that Maine and other New England states' efforts to prioritize green energy over cheaper and more efficient forms of energy have disastrous effects for ratepayers in the future. The reality is that Maine ratepayers are already experiencing financial pain caused by politicians propping up their preferred forms of energy over more efficient and reliable alternatives. Maine's net energy billing policy is already hurting families and businesses alike. We've seen rates grow dramatically in recent years since lawmakers enacted Maine's net energy billing policy, and our state's own energy public advocate has stated unequivocally that this policy cost Maine ratepayers over $220 million a year. What's also troubling for our state is the build out of offshore wind, something Governor Janet Mills has pursued in addition to the Biden administration nationally. This report makes it clear that offshore wind is the most expensive form of green energy per megawatt hour. Yet despite this, Governor Mills and her administration are moving us in this direction to the further detriment of ratepayers and our heritage lobster and fishing industries. Maine in particular has seen renewable energy subsidies force unnecessary costs onto the public with very little benefit to show for it. We should reconsider our statewide emissions goals and move towards greater reliability and affordability for power generation. Hopefully we can become a trendsetter in the future for other New England states by reversing our numerous, inefficient, and poorly justified solar and wind subsidies. Thank you for coming. I would be happy to answer any of your questions at the end.
Thank you, Harris. Great job. Next will be Giovanni from Rhode Island.
Thank you. I'm Giovanni Ciccione. I'm a long time board member and supporter of the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity, which is Rhode Island's think tank and participant in this study. I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have said here, and I don't want to certainly tell you what the study highlights are when we've already heard those from the introduction. But for Rhode Island, I think I do want to make a couple specific points, which really do apply to all of the England states. What this study shows us is that the decarbonization plans and the cost of these through 2050 is vastly underestimated by the ISO, and does not include getting, which does not calculate what it would cost to get to a level of reliability in an electric grid that New Englanders have come to expect. We are not comfortable with the idea of moving towards a system that allows for blackouts or limits capacity and doesn't give us what we expect out of our electrical grid. In order to keep that, the cost is something like $815 billion through 2050. That is a massive number per family. And that doesn't include many things that we've seen here in Rhode Island that are further hidden costs. Decommissioning costs for solar are vastly underestimated when these sites are permitted. The industry sets a number, and then local cities and towns or other governing bodies tend to accept it at face value. But we know that there is environmental harm that has to be addressed if those sites are not decommissioned properly. I think those costs need to be built into these studies. Impacts on things like the fishing industry, which is incredibly important to Rhode Island, are clear. We're seeing that even with the small offshore wind setups that are being put in place. And we also see it with just deforestation. We have a lot of these rushed solar sites being put together with massive subsidies, and landowners are taking forested properties and clear cutting them in order to put in the very valuable solar sites that we're subsidizing. So we're subsidizing deforestation in the name of green energy. And we see that with projects here in Rhode Island every year. The more broad economic development costs, we already know that we're one of the highest cost regions in the country for electricity. We've seen the impact on manufacturing jobs fleeing to the south. If you look at the cost per kilowatt hour in many states where we're losing business to, it's half of what we already charge in New England. Never mind what it will be if we go through with this incredibly irresponsible decarbonization plan. So in short, I just want the folks who are listening and reading this report to view this as it should be. It's a massive regressive tax on New England ratepayers. Rhode Island families and New England families are going to be paying significant amounts of money. It's not going to be something they get to vote on or approve. It's just going to show up in their electric bills, and it'll either be incredibly massive or it'll be ineffective. And one way or the other, we don't want to see this money go down the drain. We certainly don't want to have that surprise tax on every family that we would prefer to see. At least have a sense of what they're paying for, what they're buying. This is not the way to do it.
Thank you, Giovanni. Great job. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. I jumped over Andy. So Andy from Connecticut, I apologize, but you're next.
All good. Hello, my name is Andy Fowler. I'm the communication specialist at Yankee Institute, Connecticut's premier free market limited government public policy organization. And I'd like to thank those who are attending and my friends across New England and other national organizations for coming together to address what type of future we want for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. And so this study, The Staggering Costs of New England's Green Energy Policies, clearly demonstrates that going green and adhering to decarbonization policies will not make us better off. For some, the power going out might be a minor inconvenience, but for others, this is life-altering and even a life-threatening scenario. And Connecticut already endures one of the highest electricity rates in the nation. Just this past summer, our state's residents and businesses experienced a large spike in rates due to an increase in the public benefits charge, which passes along to consumers the cost of government mandates imposed on power companies for a variety of state energy policies, including green renewable energy. This is what life is like even before Connecticut has made a complete switch to green renewable energy, but we already see that the state's environmental policies imposed on our residents have dramatically made our lives more financially insecure and stressful. Yet Connecticut wants to be 100% carbon-free within a few decades. Again, we need to identify the costs and even need to ask ourselves, does this make our lives better? And the short answer is no. As already mentioned, Connecticut families and businesses would see their electric bills increase by hundreds and thousands of dollars, respectively. And this will only have a ripple effect, driving up the costs on everything people buy at the store. But certainly, a clean environment is an important and worthy goal, but New England is responsible for less than 0.4% of global emissions. What's worse is that if we switch to 100% renewable energies and spend hundreds of billions of dollars to do so, residents will become less likely to be able to turn on their lights, charge their phone, watch TV, power their appliances, and so much more that makes this, the best of times in human history. Instead, they can expect rolling blackouts. For context, nearly 90% of Connecticut households rely on electricity for heat during the cold winter months. For rolling blackouts to become a possibility in the future is a future we should want to avoid. But there has been some encouraging news recently. Governor Ned Lamont recently took an electric vehicle mandate off the table, which we applaud him for. And the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, or PURA, which regulates rates, voted to deny a rate increase just yesterday. But however, the Connecticut General Assembly is possibly considering extreme environmental regulations like the so-called Green Monster Bill and even a Green Amendment. If enacted, these detrimental policies will not only make us poorer, but also leave us in the literal dark. It is time for a sensible energy policy, one that balances prudent environmental stewardship with economic productivity and prosperity, and we hope lawmakers take heed of the policy solutions this new study proposes. Thank you.
Great job, Andy. Thank you. Drew Klein is from New Hampshire, is going to conclude, and then we'll open it to questions.
All right, thanks, Paul. I'm Drew Klein. I'm president of the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy, New Hampshire's free market think tank. And I think one of the most important takeaways from this study is that it validates New Hampshire's reluctance over the decades to impose this sort of unrealistic energy mandates that other New England states have imposed. And when you go through the report, I'd like to point out to reporters that it finds that because New Hampshire has more realistic energy policies and lacks the sort of electrification mandates for transportation and home heating, we reduce the peak system demand throughout New England for electricity by 4.5 gigawatts. And I'm going to quote from the report here. New Hampshire's current energy policies would save all New Englanders $56.5 billion during the time period studied. That's really, I think, important to note because New Hampshire has been attacked and ridiculed for not imposing these kinds of mandates. And when it comes down to it, the reason we haven't done that is because of these trade-offs. The other New England states pretend that they can mandate good things without making any trade-offs in cost or reliability. And New Hampshire has looked into this and said, no, those trade-offs are important. And we have to make sure to protect our citizens, that our citizens have reliable power, energy that stays on, home heating that's available throughout the winter, and that the cost is affordable. These things matter. Trade-offs matter. You can't just use government to impose a fantasy on your citizens in which no one ever has to make a trade-off. So when you look at this report, I hope that people will take away from it this sort of fundamental understanding that trade-offs matter and that governments can't simply mandate them away. These things impose costs. And when you're looking at the costs that this report has uncovered in terms of a reduction in reliability, which would lead to rolling blackouts, and massive increases in costs for families, for businesses, for manufacturers, if these policies aren't changed, a lot of people are going to have to make really uncomfortable decisions. Businesses are going to have to decide whether they're going to lay off people or whether they're going to move outside of the region. Low-income families are going to have to decide what to do in the winter when peak demand is switched from summer to winter and these prices increase. it's going to pose real burdens on low-income families in New England. Not to mention the rolling blackouts that people aren't going to have a choice about. Those are going to be imposed by ISO New England if we go forward with all these schemes. So, as we noted in the report, all of the organizations behind this report want cleaner air and water, want cleaner environment. But we acknowledge that there are good and bad ways to get there. The market has done a really good job of moving us in the right direction over the last few decades. These really unrealistic mandates are not the right path forward. And I think this study shows that in very clear detail.
Well said, Drew. The last two speakers highlighted the rolling blackouts, which is a huge part of the study. So thank you guys for making sure that a very important part is included. I wanted to open up to questions from media. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself. Please state your name and the organization you work for, and direct it to anyone specific.
This is Steve Singer at the Portland Press Herald in Maine. My question is to Mr. Klein. Could you tell me what the market has done? You mentioned that the market has brought these solutions. I'm wondering what you can point to in terms of what market-based solutions have achieved.
Are you familiar at all with the U.S. Emissions reductions in the last couple of decades? I just would point to that.
Those
United States has actually reduced emissions.
Aren't the emissions reductions weren't part of the CAFE standards and imposed on the federal level?
I think they were largely driven by increase in switching to natural gas for energy production.
Thank you, Stephen.
Paul, it's Allison Kuznets from the News Service. Could you talk a little bit about just looking at where we are in Massachusetts right now, of how this report stacks up with looking at on the governor's desk is an economic development bill which has major investments for climate tech, offshore wind, and also the clean energy bill?
I think it's a waste of money. What the governor and what Massachusetts is pursuing is a waste of money, because our study shows that these are policy goals that are not achievable unless they come with significant economic harm to someone's constituents and potential rolling blackouts. So I think our state leaders in Massachusetts need to reverse course on pursuing wind, solar, and battery as a way to power Massachusetts. It's not realistic. Our study shows it comes at a very significant cost. Allison, there was a page in our study that I outlined in the beginning that shows how much it's going to cost Massachusetts residents, and it is the highest in all the states. It's a visual chart to show what our future is going to look like. So I hope Governor Healy, Speaker Ron Mariota, when he comes back from vacation, the Senate President huddle up and realize reality is starting to hit. And then you have what's going on the federal side of everything, and no one really knows what's going to happen. But there's probably going to be a lot more competition brought back into lower costs. So New England's going to have to deal with a country that's probably going to see their energy costs go down significantly in the future, which is only going to put us at a more of a disadvantage. So I hope I answer your question.
It's Kevin Landrigan at the union leader in New Hampshire. Even though New Hampshire may have adopted different policies, since ISO is so interconnected, aren't these policies in New England going to affect New Hampshire almost as much as all the other New England states?
Drew or AFP, do you guys want to answer that one?
I mean, yes. So again, because it's a grid, I mean, you're right, Kevin. As the report shows, these costs are going to go up. I mean, even in New Hampshire, we're going to see increased costs for this. You know, if all these policies remain in place and the other states move towards those goals and actually, you know, follow through on the policies in terms of making this transition to using wind and solar, that will absolutely affect New Hampshire's costs. I mean, we have this in the report. I don't have the page number, but you can scroll through and find it. So New Hampshire's costs will go up. The threat of rolling blackouts will affect New Hampshire as well as everybody else. When I pointed to the bright spot in the report, it for New Hampshire, it notes that because New Hampshire didn't go as far as the other states did in making these mandates, we save New England $56.5 billion. And that's a wonderful savings, but that does not negate the fact that the costs are going to go up on the whole because of these mandates across the board throughout the region. So in other words, New Hampshire kept the costs from increasing by another $56.5 billion, put it that way, but they're still going up.
And Kevin, what I would add to that is we're paying the price for neighbors with really expensive habits, and we can do our part of it, but the electrons that go into the grid, they flow all around. They don't just stay in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire makes, depending on any given time, between 130 and 170% of its own demand. So the rest of the region is depending on New Hampshire to do its part in order to power the rest of the states in the region. But yes, the answer is because it's a regional grid, we are going to pay for the cost of the other people, because we can go through talk about the purchase power agreements and things like that. Those things all have an impact on the cost it takes to pull an electron out of the transmission. So there isn't a cost, and it will impact New Hampshire.
Well, and also Greg made a great point, and this is addressed in the report as well. Because New Hampshire stuck with natural gas and didn't force this transition, it reduces the electricity demand throughout the region by 4.5 gigawatts, meaning that there's less stress on the grid, which reduces the, I guess you would say, the number of days that there might be rolling blackouts, because we actually lower the demand for electricity during those peak times because we didn't force this electrification. And we're providing baseload power from those plants, from our nuclear plant and from our natural gas. So New Hampshire is actually not just saving money, we're improving the reliability of the whole region. So honestly, these other states should be really grateful that New Hampshire hasn't moved as fast as they have in doing these mandates, because if those other mandates go through, they're going to be more dependent on New Hampshire in the winter to have their reliable power than ever before.
Page 28 and 29 show some really good graphs for how much each state would pay, including New Hampshire. I do want to go on. I think there's some questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, anyone else has any questions in the media, please share with them.
Yeah, hi, Henry Schwan from the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. A lot of information here, but what about cutting consumer demand? I mean, you're talking about everybody needing power to power this and that, but there's no talk here about cutting consumer demand. What's the feeling here about that?
I mean, I'll say on that front, increased demand is it's going to increase nationally. You're seeing companies that are involved in artificial intelligence, for instance, investing into nuclear technology. Demand is going to increase no matter what if we are going to increase well-being for society at large. If we're talking about cutting demand, asking people to cut back on their energy consumption like some other countries are doing, that's sort of, in my mind, a dystopian sort of future. We should be looking at growth and providing more well-being and more fulfillment and more opportunity for every single citizen, instead of basically sentencing them to a future of energy, without the capacity to provide the quality of life that they have now. So energy, like I mentioned earlier, is the lifeblood of this economy, of the world economy. To ask people, you have to cut, certain things out of your life for the good of the whole, that's going to hurt the most vulnerable, the struggling among us, the absolute most. And we should be looking at growth opportunities, not shrinking shrinking the contribution to the grid and our overall economy.
And a study also says that the demand for electricity is going to increase by 106% by 2050. And that's because of home heating and transportation sectors. But we know for a fact that that's not a viable option. Henry, you cannot limit people's power when we're going by 106%.
And let's not forget that we're on the flip side imposing EV mandates on people. That's just going to exacerbate the problem. And then you see the California example of they're rolling blackouts and their requirements that people not charge their cars at certain times. Right. This is how poorly thought out this whole transition, so-called green transition is. We're siloing every idea that comes in as if they don't have impacts, throughout the economy, throughout the grid, whatever it is. It's not a well thought out plan. It's rushed. It's an extreme solution, and that's why we get these ridiculous scenarios.
Yeah, and I think Giovanni's point is well made. The report shows that the green energy, the electrification mandates increase demand for electricity. So the government policy is driving up demand for electricity. That's really a key part of this. New Hampshire is saving money, but also saving demand on the grid. It's in the report. We reduced demand for electricity by 4.5 gigawatts because we don't mandate electrification. We let people still use home heating oil and natural gas and nuclear power. So we're not driving that. So for part one, the government is driving a lot of this increase in demand by forcing electrification quickly. But number two, to Ross's point, which is a great point, part of this growth in just demand for energy, whether it's oil-based or generated by wind or solar, is economic growth and is technology-based. So that stuff is happening naturally. People in their own lives are finding that they want and need more energy use. And you get the role of government here backwards if you put the government first to say, well, we have to tell you, we have to restrict your energy use. And that's our role here. The government, the people aren't serving the government serves the people. So when they are naturally increasing their energy use through AI and adoption of new technologies and just basic economic growth, the government's role here is to accommodate that and let that growth happen, not to try to stop it and stifle that growth, which would have terrible impacts, as Ross pointed out, on the whole of the economy, which affects folks at the low end of the economic ladder really hard.
We are over our promise to end by 11, so I just want to open up to one last question, if there are any.
Yeah, I just have a quick political question. This is Michael Graham, New Hampshire Journal. The hotly contested governor's race here barely featured a conversation about energy or energy prices. The Democrat running for governor had an energy proposal that came without a price tag. She never released the amount it would cost. I'm just curious, in the other states, is this turned into an actual people vote on it issue, or is this just something people grouse about and then go back and vote on other issues?
I think we should definitely flag this for David in Vermont, because I think he can answer it best right now.
Yeah, so I would say that energy was really probably one of the number one issue in our last election cycle a few weeks ago, and there were many people who had supported many of these mandates who were voted out of office, in large part because they had supported those policies. So now the makeup of the legislature is completely changed. So there's more people there who are more open to seeing what other options are available for affordable energy in Vermont.
And I'll just say on this point, we at AFP Foundation have done a lot of work in Vermont, and one race there that to sort of highlight, there was a state senator who lost his reelection after saying that he, in response to the question, how will poor Vermonters be able to afford to pay these higher energy prices and heat their homes? His response was put on a sweater. So that person then ended up losing his election. And across the state of Vermont, there was a giant whiplash, like David mentioned, almost entirely in response to the issue of energy mandates that are driving up costs.
Right. I want to conclude. Thank you all for joining. It is 11:15. Guy, I see you have a hand up, so I am going to let you ask the final question, but then we're going to conclude, okay?
So I just want to really thank you for doing this. And it's more of a, in addition to what Dave just said, not only were senators voted out, but there's even the remaining real climate hawk senators in Vermont are saying, well, gee, I really don't see the clean heat standard coming up for a vote this year. So they have at least expressing the fact that they've gotten religion. Whether they have or not, that we'll know that better in January.
All right. Thank you, Guy. Thank you all for joining this call. The report will be put online, be sent out to all of our distributions, and we hope our policymakers in our states reverse course, except for New Hampshire. Thank you all.